King Edward I's early reign, 1274 to 1296, the Conquest of Wales. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd emerged from the Barons' War as the dominant leader in Wales, strengthening his control over vast territories and solidifying his rule as Prince of Wales. His authority was officially acknowledged in the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, which granted him control over lands he had seized in the Forcantrefs of Perfedwlad. However, this diplomatic success did little to ease tensions with the powerful Marcher lords, including the Earl of Gloucester, Roger Mortimer, and Humphrey de Bohun, 3rd Earl of Hereford. These influential figures saw Llewellyn's growing power as a direct threat to their own territorial interests, leading to ongoing skirmishes and disputes. This hostility was further exacerbated by centuries of Anglo-Welsh conflicts, making long-term peace unattainable. Llewellyn's increasing assertion of independence, combined with his efforts to consolidate Welsh rule, positioned him as a formidable adversary to English expansionist ambitions. Edward I's motivations for the Welsh campaign. Edward I was a determined and ambitious monarch who sought to consolidate his rule over Britain. His campaign in Wales was part of a broader strategy to strengthen the English monarchy by securing its borders and eliminating threats. He viewed Llewellyn's refusal to do homage as an act of defiance and a challenge to royal authority. Additionally, Edward sought to secure vital trade routes and ensure the stability of his realm by bringing Wales under direct English control. His military background, including participation in the Ninth Crusade, had shaped his tactical approach and his belief in absolute rule, which played a crucial role in his decision to launch the Welsh campaign. Furthermore, Edward sought to establish a precedent for dealing with semi-independent territories, setting the stage for his later campaigns in Scotland and Ireland. The economic and political significance of Wales. Wales was not only a military target but also an economically valuable territory. Rich in natural resources, particularly timber and minerals, Wales had the potential to strengthen the English economy. Control over Welsh ports would allow England greater influence over trade routes in the Irish Sea, further integrating Wales into the English economic system. Additionally, the control of Wales allowed Edward to implement his feudal policies more effectively, ensuring loyalty through land grants and military service. Internal struggles and English provocation. Despite his outward strength, Llewellyn's leadership faced internal instability. In 1274, his own brother, Dafydd, alongside the influential Welsh Lord Gruffydd ap Gwenwyn of Powys, attempted to assassinate him. When their plot failed, they sought refuge in England, gaining protection from King Edward I. Llewellyn regarded this as an outright betrayal, further exacerbated when Edward provided sanctuary and support to his enemies. When Edward demanded Llewellyn's formal homage, the Welsh prince refused, citing Edward's harbouring of his adversaries as just cause. This diplomatic standoff escalated when Llewellyn sought to marry Eleanor de Montfort, the daughter of Simon de Montfort the Elder, a former rebel against the English monarchy. Edward viewed this alliance as an act of defiance and a direct challenge to his authority, pushing tensions to a breaking point. The role of the Church in the conquest. The Church played a significant role in Edward's campaign against Wales. While some clergy attempted to mediate peace, others supported Edward's efforts to bring Wales under English control. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, sought to negotiate a resolution between Llewellyn and Edward, but his efforts failed. Edward also used the Church as a tool of assimilation, ensuring that English bishops replaced Welsh religious leaders and that ecclesiastical structures were aligned with English governance. Monasteries became centres of English influence, and the Church was used as a means to suppress Welsh cultural identity and reinforce English authority. Additionally, the construction of new churches and the reorganisation of dioceses were instrumental in extending English control into all aspects of Welsh life. Edward's first campaign, 1276 to 1277. By November 1276, negotiations had failed, and Edward declared war on Llewellyn. His military strategy was swift and overwhelming. Experienced commanders such as Roger Mortimer, Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, and William de Beauchamp spearheaded the English campaign, systematically isolating Llewellyn from his allies. By July 1277, Edward had assembled a force of 15,500 troops, including 9,000 Welsh soldiers loyal to the English crown. Despite the size of the force, Llewellyn was unable to muster sufficient resistance, and large-scale battles were avoided. With dwindling support and a vastly superior English army at his doorstep, Llewellyn was forced to surrender. The Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in November 1277, drastically curtailed his power, reducing his control to Gwynedd, although he was permitted to retain his title of Prince of Wales. The treaty marked the beginning of Edward's firm grip over Wales and set the stage for further conflict. The Welsh Revolt, 1282 to 1283. Despite Edward's victory, tensions remained high. By 1282, open rebellion erupted again, this time as a wider movement among the Welsh people. This conflict was not merely a territorial dispute, it was a battle for Welsh sovereignty, national identity, and the preservation of traditional laws. The uprising was sparked by Dafydd, who, despite previously aligning with Edward, became disillusioned with the limited rewards he had received. His defection was a catalyst for renewed conflict, and Llewellyn and other Welsh nobles quickly joined the rebellion, viewing it as their final opportunity to resist English encroachment. However, unlike previous conflicts, this war saw more organized resistance, with Welsh forces utilizing the mountainous terrain to their advantage and launching a series of coordinated attacks against English forces. The long-term effects of Edward's conquest. Edward's victory had long-term consequences for both England and Wales. The Welsh nobility was systematically replaced with English lords, who were granted lands and titles in the newly conquered territory. This not only weakened Welsh autonomy but also created tensions between native inhabitants and the new ruling class. Over time, resentment toward English rule grew, leading to continued uprisings and political instability. The integration of Wales into the English legal system. Edward sought to solidify his conquest by integrating Wales into the English legal framework. The Statute of Rhuddlan, 1284, established English governance in Wales, introducing English laws and administrative systems. Although some Welsh customs were retained, particularly in property disputes, the overarching goal was to ensure that English law took precedence. This legal restructuring set the foundation for future policies that would further incorporate Wales into the English kingdom. Long-term Welsh resistance and cultural resilience. Despite Edward's conquest, Welsh resistance persisted in various forms. Cultural resilience remained strong, with Welsh poets and bards preserving national identity through storytelling and music. The enforcement of English rule did not erase Welsh customs, and over time, nationalistic sentiments continued to develop, eventually leading to future uprisings, including the famous rebellion of Owain Glyndwr in the early 15th century. Additionally, Welsh laws and traditions, though suppressed, were kept alive through oral tradition and local customs, ensuring that the unique identity of Wales was not entirely lost. Edward I's conquest of Wales was a transformative moment in medieval British history. Although he achieved military success, his policies left a lasting legacy of bitterness and unrest. His strict governance and colonization efforts ensured English control, yet they also fueled continued Welsh resistance and the preservation of a distinct Welsh identity. The repercussions of his conquest shaped Welsh-English relations for centuries, leaving an enduring impact on the cultural and political landscape of Britain. Even centuries later, the Welsh people's sense of national identity remained strong, demonstrating the resilience of a culture that, despite military defeat, refused to be entirely extinguished. Edward's conquest of Wales was not merely a military endeavour but a political and cultural transformation that shaped the region's history for generations to come. Edward I's foreign policy and the unfulfilled Crusade ambitions. The Crusading Vow and its influence on European politics. Although Edward I never again embarked on a crusade after his return to England in 1274, his intention to do so significantly shaped his foreign policy for nearly 2 decades. In 1287, he took a solemn vow to lead another crusade, a commitment that guided his diplomatic and military strategies. His vision of a renewed European-wide crusade depended on stability among the great powers of the continent, as internal conflicts between European sovereigns would divert resources and attention away from the Holy Land. Edward sought to act as a mediator in European affairs, positioning himself as a leader in Christendom who could unify factions and direct their efforts towards reclaiming the Holy Land. One of the greatest obstacles to a unified Christian front was the ongoing rivalry between the Capetian House of Anjou, which controlled southern Italy, and the Crown of Aragon in Spain. This struggle intensified in 1282 with the outbreak of the Sicilian Vespers, when the citizens of Palermo revolted against Charles of Anjou and invited Peter III of Aragon to intervene. The subsequent war between France and Aragon threatened to escalate into a broader European conflict, jeopardizing any hopes of a crusade. Understanding the urgency of maintaining peace, Edward traveled to Paris in 1286, where he successfully brokered a truce between France and Aragon. This agreement secured the release of Charles of Anjou's son, Charles of Salerno, and temporarily averted a large-scale war. Despite Edward's diplomatic efforts, his crusading ambitions ultimately came to nothing. The final blow to his plans came in 1291 when the Mamluks captured Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. This event marked the effective end of the Crusader states and shattered any realistic hope of launching a new campaign in the near future. With the loss of Acre, Edward redirected his focus towards securing his own territories and strengthening England's position in continental affairs. Edward also sought papal support for his crusading ambitions, maintaining correspondence with Rome to secure spiritual and financial backing. However, the papacy, preoccupied with European disputes and its own consolidation of power, proved reluctant to commit significant resources to another crusade. The lack of unified support further diminished the feasibility of Edward's plans, leaving him unable to fulfill his oath. Edward I's rule in Gascony and the challenge of French overlordship. Edward was deeply involved in the administration of his Duchy of Gascony, a valuable yet precarious English possession within the French kingdom. His rule there was marked by repeated challenges to his authority and ongoing tensions with the French crown. To ensure effective governance, he assigned trusted officials such as Otto de Grandson and Chancellor Robert Burnell to investigate Gascon affairs. This inquiry led to the replacement of the Seneschal Luc de Tanny in 1278, reflecting Edward's commitment to maintaining stability and efficiency in the duchy. In 1286, Edward personally travelled to Gascony, where he remained for nearly 3 years to oversee the administration of his lands. His time there was marked by an extraordinary event in 1287 when he suffered a near-fatal accident. While standing in a tower, the floor collapsed beneath him, sending him plummeting 80 feet. He sustained a broken collarbone and was confined to bed for months. Several others did not survive the fall. Upon his recovery, Edward ordered the expulsion of the local Jewish population from Gascony, seemingly as a thank-offering for his survival. This act was consistent with his broader policy of expelling Jews from England in 1290, reflecting both personal piety and political considerations. The greatest challenge to Edward's rule in Gascony was the complex feudal relationship between the duchy and the French crown. As Duke of Gascony, Edward was a vassal of the French king, which often placed him in a subservient position in diplomatic affairs. In 1286, he had paid homage to the new French king, Philip IV, in recognition of this feudal bond. However, tensions escalated in 1293 when a dispute over piracy led to open hostilities between England and France. English, Gascon, Norman, and French sailors engaged in acts of maritime aggression, culminating in the English seizure of several French ships and the sacking of the port of La Rochelle. In response, Edward's brother, Edmund Crouchback, attempted to negotiate peace by allowing Philip IV to temporarily occupy Gascony's chief fortresses as a gesture of goodwill. However, Philip refused to relinquish control of these strongholds, effectively annexing Gascony. When Edward refused to appear before Philip in Paris to settle the matter, the French king formally declared the duchy forfeit. This act provoked Edward into a prolonged and costly war to reclaim his lost territories. Edward's difficulties in Gascony highlighted the limitations of England's position in France. His reliance on diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military alliances proved insufficient to counter Philip IV's expansionist policies. This struggle underscored the challenges of medieval kingship, where even the most powerful rulers had to navigate intricate feudal obligations. Edward's engagement with the Mongols. During this period, Edward maintained diplomatic communications with the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia. These interactions had begun during his earlier crusade, when he explored the possibility of forming an alliance against their common Muslim enemies. Even after his return to England, he continued to correspond with the Mongol court in hopes of securing military cooperation for a future crusade. While residing in Gascony in 1287, Edward hosted Mongol envoys at his court. Among them was the Nestorian Christian monk Rabban Bar Soma, who recorded a detailed account of their meeting. This diplomatic exchange reaffirmed Edward's interest in Mongol-Christian relations and the potential for a joint campaign in the east. In 1289 and 1290, further Mongol embassies arrived in Europe with proposals from Ilkhan Abaka, offering to supply horses and support for a renewed Christian offensive in the Holy Land. Despite these overtures, Edward was unable to act on them. His financial and military resources were stretched thin by the conflicts in Gascony and Wales, and he lacked the necessary papal authorization to launch a new crusade. Nevertheless, his decision to send Geoffrey of Langley as an ambassador to the Mongols demonstrated his serious consideration of their proposals. The death of Eleanor of Castile and its impact on Edward. On the 28th of November, 1290, Edward suffered a profound personal loss when his beloved wife, Eleanor of Castile, passed away. Their marriage had been one of mutual affection and respect, and Edward remained devoted to her throughout their time together. Her death deeply affected him, and he expressed his grief through an extraordinary act of memorialization. Edward ordered the construction of 12 grand stone crosses, known as the Eleanor Crosses, to mark the locations where her funeral procession stopped on its journey from Lincoln to Westminster Abbey. These crosses, some of which still stand today, were among the most elaborate and enduring monuments of medieval England. His public display of mourning reinforced the image of Edward as a ruler who valued loyalty and personal devotion, traits that had defined his reign. The Anglo-French War and the Treaty of Montreuil. In 1294, the ongoing tensions between England and France erupted into war following a series of naval skirmishes between English and Norman privateers. Philip IV seized upon the opportunity to confiscate Gascony, forcing Edward to renounce his homage and declare war. The initial conflict in Gascony was followed by Edward's efforts to forge a broad coalition against France. Edward sought allies among the rulers of Europe, enlisting the support of the King of Germany, the Count of Flanders, and the Barons of Franche-Comté. Additionally, his son-in-laws, the Duke of Brabant and the Count of Bar-le-Duc, joined the English alliance. Edward's grand strategy was to stretch French forces by attacking on multiple fronts. His allies inflicted significant damage in Champagne, Burgundy, and other regions, disrupting Philip IV's ability to consolidate power. Edward I's later foreign policy was marked by his ambitions for another crusade, his struggles over Gascony, and his complex diplomatic engagements across Europe and beyond. His efforts ultimately shaped the balance of power on the continent. His military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, and ability to maintain alliances underscored his role as one of England's most influential monarchs. Though his crusading dreams never materialized, his legacy of political strategy and territorial ambition endured for generations. Great cause. By the 1280s, the relationship between England and Scotland was largely one of peaceful coexistence. Unlike in Wales, where the issue of homage was a source of contention, Scotland's position regarding homage to the English crown did not create as much controversy. In 1278, King Alexander III of Scotland formally paid homage to King Edward I of England. However, the nature of this homage was specific. Alexander acknowledged Edward only for the lands he held in England, rather than recognizing Edward as his feudal overlord for Scotland itself. This distinction kept relations relatively stable, as it allowed Scotland to maintain its independence while still acknowledging the superior power of England in a limited capacity. Background on Anglo-Scottish relations prior to the 1280s. The relationship between England and Scotland had historically been shaped by periods of both conflict and alliance. Earlier in the Middle Ages, the two nations had clashed over territorial disputes, but also engaged in intermarriages among their royal families to maintain diplomacy. The Treaty of Falaise in 1174 had placed Scotland under English overlordship after King William I of Scotland was captured at the Battle of Alnwick. However, the treaty was nullified in 1189 when Richard the Lionheart sold Scottish independence back to William to fund his crusades. This historical precedent of fluctuating power dynamics influenced later interactions between the two realms. Scotland's position as an independent kingdom was often tested by its more powerful southern neighbour. Although territorial disputes were common, trade between the two nations flourished, and cultural exchanges were frequent. The Scottish nobility often had ties to English landowners through marriage, and there were periods of mutual cooperation. However, the idea of English overlordship remained a sensitive issue, with Scottish kings maintaining their independence while acknowledging the influence of England in certain affairs. Political and economic landscape of Scotland in the late 13th century. During the late 13th century, Scotland was a prosperous kingdom with a strong feudal system. The nobility held extensive landholdings, and the economy was bolstered by trade with European countries such as France, Norway, and the Low Countries. Scottish towns like Berwick-upon-Tweed thrived as commercial centres, with merchants trading goods such as wool, hides, and fish. Scotland's economy was largely agrarian, with rural communities engaged in farming and livestock rearing. The nation's wealth allowed it to maintain a formidable military force, which consisted of both knights and common foot soldiers. Despite internal feudal rivalries, Scotland maintained a relatively stable governance structure under King Alexander III. His reign was marked by efforts to secure the kingdom's independence and prosperity, making his sudden death in 1286 all the more destabilizing. Under his rule, Scotland had enjoyed a period of relative peace and economic growth, and his ability to balance the interests of the nobility had helped maintain political stability. The succession crisis and Edward I's expanding influence. Tensions between the two nations began to surface following the death of Alexander III in 1286. His passing created a significant crisis in the Scottish succession, as his only surviving descendant was his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. Since Margaret was still a child and unable to rule independently, Scottish leaders sought a diplomatic solution to ensure the kingdom's stability. In 1290, the Treaty of Bergen was agreed upon, stipulating that Margaret would marry King Edward's 6-year-old son, Edward of Carnarvon, the future Edward II of England. The treaty included specific provisions to safeguard Scotland's sovereignty, ensuring that despite the marriage alliance, Scotland would remain free of English overlordship. Unfortunately, the carefully arranged plan was never realized. In the autumn of 1290, the young Margaret set sail from Norway to Scotland to assume her role as queen, but during the journey, she fell ill and died in Orkney. Her unexpected death threw Scotland into a state of uncertainty and turmoil, as there was no clear heir to the throne. This situation led to the crisis known as the Great Cause, a contentious dispute over the Scottish crown. Edward I's policies toward other territories. Edward I had already demonstrated his ambition for expansion by subjugating Wales in 1282, installing English administration, and constructing massive castles to consolidate his rule. His conquest of Wales served as a template for his approach to Scotland. Viewing Scotland's instability as an opportunity, Edward sought to extend his authority over the northern kingdom as he had done with Wales. Edward's reputation as a strong and determined ruler had been built on his military successes and his ability to centralize power. His conquest of Wales had demonstrated his strategic acumen, and he sought to apply similar tactics in Scotland. However, unlike Wales, which had been a collection of smaller principalities, Scotland was a unified kingdom with a well-established monarchy and legal system. Edward's ambitions in Scotland would thus face stronger resistance. The Great Cause and Edward I's power play. 14 claimants put forward their cases for the Scottish throne. The two most prominent contenders were John Balliol and Robert de Brasse, 5th Lord of Annandale. The Scottish nobility, faced with a difficult decision, turned to King Edward I of England for assistance. The Scots did not ask Edward to act as an arbitrator with the authority to make a binding decision, rather, they sought his involvement only to oversee the process and ensure its proper administration. To determine the rightful heir, a panel of 104 auditors was established, 40 appointed by Balliol, 40 by Brasse, and 24 selected by Edward from among the senior figures of the Scottish political community. Edward, however, manipulated the proceedings to his advantage. He insisted that before he could settle the dispute, he had to be fully recognized as Scotland's feudal overlord. The Scottish leaders, wary of English domination, resisted this demand. They argued that without a king, no one in Scotland had the authority to make such a concession on behalf of the realm. However, Edward found a way to bypass this obstacle. He convinced the claimants to agree that Scotland would be placed under his direct authority until a rightful heir was determined. After extensive deliberations, a verdict was reached on the 17th of November, 1292, in favour of John Balliol. Balliol was crowned King of Scotland, but his reign would be overshadowed by Edward's continuous assertions of dominance. Despite his formal recognition as king, Balliol found his authority challenged at every turn by Edward, who treated him as a vassal rather than an independent monarch. The role of the Scottish Church in the crisis. The Scottish Church played a significant role in the unfolding conflict. Many clergy members resisted Edward's attempts to interfere with Scotland's sovereignty, rallying behind Balliol despite his weakened position. The Church's influence in Scottish politics and its alignment with nationalist sentiments helped fuel resistance against English encroachment. Scottish resistance and the Old Alliance. The breaking point came when Edward ordered the Scottish magnates to provide military service for his campaign against France. The Scots, unwilling to be drawn into England's conflicts, refused and instead sought an alliance with France, formalising the Old Alliance in 1295. Outraged by Scotland's defiance, Edward launched a full-scale invasion in 1296. His forces swiftly captured Berwick-upon-Tweed, a vital Scottish port town. The attack on Berwick was particularly brutal, with Edward's army massacring thousands of civilians in a show of force designed to intimidate the Scots into submission. Following this, at the Battle of Dunbar, the Scottish resistance was decisively crushed. The impact of Edward's policies. Edward I's actions in Scotland marked the beginning of a long and bitter conflict that would define Anglo-Scottish relations for generations. His aggressive policies not only alienated the Scots but also laid the foundation for the Wars of Scottish Independence. The resistance movement, spearheaded by figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, would transform the struggle into a full-scale war for national independence. Edward's heavy-handed tactics ultimately fueled Scottish nationalism and cemented Scotland's resolve to resist English domination for years to come. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.